In a system where almost every enslaved person was sold at auction, one name appears in the records, without a sale, no price, no explanation. Why? In the 18th and 19th centuries, long before the word auction carried any neutral association with antiques or estates, it referred to one of the most ordinary public rituals in the Atlantic slave world. On certain mornings, in towns that otherwise bustled with trade, worship, and civic life, people gathered knowing precisely what would be sold. The familiarity of the event was itself part of its power. Nothing about the setting suggested secrecy or shame. Instead, the sale of human beings unfolded in the open, as predictable as market day, and just as integrated into the economy that sustained these communities. Across British North America and the early United States, slave auctions took place wherever commerce already thrived. Courthouse steps, wharves, tavern yards, and town squares became stages for transactions that converted people into property. Timing was often deliberate. Auctions were scheduled to coincide with court sessions, harvest seasons, or ship arrivals, moments when buyers were already present and money was circulating. Notices appeared in newspapers days or weeks in advance, listing the time and place, sometimes naming the enslaved individuals to be sold, sometimes reducing them to numbers and categories. By the time the day arrived, the outcome felt prearranged, even though the bidding itself remained uncertain. The logistics of these auctions reflected a system refined over generations. Enslaved people were brought in from plantations or vessels, sometimes traveling miles under guard, sometimes held overnight in pens or rented rooms near the auction site. On the morning of the sale, they were arranged for display, washed or oiled to enhance appearance, instructed to stand straight, to answer questions, to perform small demonstrations of strength or skill. The process was methodical, designed to maximize price and minimize disruption. What might appear chaotic to an outsider followed a strict internal order, understood by auctioneers, traders, and buyers alike. At the heart of this order lay economic logic. Auctions were not merely one method of sale. They were the most efficient mechanism available to a society built on human bondage. Public bidding created competition, driving prices upward while establishing a visible market value for labor, age, and perceived health. For sellers, whether large planters settling estates or traders clearing inventories, auctions promised liquidity. For buyers, they offered choice and comparison, the ability to weigh one life against another in full view of peers. The public nature of the sale also spread responsibility thinly, embedding the transaction within accepted norms rather than individual conscience. Yet the efficiency of the system depended on a form of violence that left no blood on the ground. Enslaved people were inspected openly, their bodies read as document of future profit. Teeth were examined, muscles touched, scars questioned. Women were asked about fertility, men about endurance. These assessments were conducted in a language that pretended to be clinical, but their meaning was unmistakable. To be evaluated so completely in front of strangers was to be denied privacy and personhood at once. The psychological weight of that exposure pressed down even when no physical force was applied. Accounts from the period describe the atmosphere of an auction square with striking consistency. There was the sound of the auctioneer's voice, practiced and rhythmic, rising and falling as bids were called. There was the murmur of buyers calculating silently, occasionally conferring with one another. There were moments when the crowd leaned forward, attentive, and others when interest faded and conversation drifted. Beneath it all were subtler sensations, the smell of dust churned by feet, of sweat in summer heat, of nearby goods, tobacco, grain, fish, blurring the boundary between human and commodity. And there were silences too, when bidding stalled and time seemed to hang, leaving those on the block suspended between futures. For the enslaved, auction day compressed fear, hope, and calculation into a single stretch of hours. Some stood alone, others beside family members, each glance carrying unspoken questions about separation and survival. A mother might measure bidders' faces, searching for clues, while a young man tried to appear strong without appearing defiant. Even the smallest gesture could feel consequential. To be sold quickly might mean escape from the block, but it could also mean removal to an unknown place. To linger unsold invited its own dread. The system offered no outcome untouched by loss. Buyers and sellers performed their own emotional calculations. For many buyers, the act of bidding required a careful distancing, a narrowing of attention to price and utility. Sentiment was an acknowledged liability. Sellers, particularly those disposing of inherited or debt-bound property, sometimes expressed discomfort, but rarely enough to interrupt the transaction. The auction allowed all parties to participate while maintaining the fiction that responsibility rested elsewhere, in the market itself, in necessity, in law. This fiction was reinforced by the language preserved in documents. Ledgers recorded names beside figures, ages approximated, skills summarized in a few words. Bills of sale formalized the exchange, transforming lived experience into legal abstraction. Advertisements spoke of prime hands, sound stock, likely boys, terms that erased individuality in favor of usefulness. These words were not accidental. They shaped perception, training readers to see people as entries in a balance sheet. Over time, the repetition of this language hardened into normalcy, making the extraordinary cruelty of the system appear routine. The abundance of such records is striking. Archives are filled with notices, receipts, inventories, and court documents that trace the movement of enslaved people through auctions like a map of transactions. For historians, these papers provide both evidence and constraint. They reveal patterns, prices, and practices, yet they rarely capture interior lives. What they do show, with chilling clarity, is how rarely the system failed to document itself. Almost every enslaved man and woman appears somewhere in this web of sale, their existence intersecting the auction block at least once. It is against this backdrop of meticulous record-keeping that certain anomalies stand out. Occasionally, a name surfaces where a sale should be. A ledger includes an individual listed among others, yet the column for price is blank. An advertisement announces an upcoming auction, but subsequent records do not confirm that the sale occurred. These absences are small, easy to overlook, but they disrupt the expectations of completeness. In a system designed to capture value so precisely, a missing transaction feels like a pause in the machinery. One such trace introduces a quiet question. If nearly every enslaved man passed through an auction, why did this one not appear as expected? The records offer no immediate answer. There is no dramatic notation, no explanation scrawled in the margins. There is simply a name followed by silence. To modern eyes, trained to search for presence, the absence can seem like an error. But within historical research, absence often signals complexity rather than mistake. This gap invites speculation, but careful narration resists the urge to fill it too quickly. There are many reasons a sale might not have occurred as planned. An illness, a private transaction, a death unrecorded, a legal dispute, or a decision made quietly between individuals could all remove someone from the public auction without leaving a clear trail. Each possibility carries its own implications, yet none can be confirmed without further evidence. What remains is the unsettling fact that the system's usual transparency faltered. In focusing on this absence, attention shifts from spectacle to silence. The auction block, so visible and loud, defined the experience of slavery for countless people. To imagine someone moving through this world without passing through that ritual challenges assumptions about uniformity. It suggests that even within a rigid system, lives did not always follow the same documented path. The absence does not diminish the brutality of the system. Instead, it sharpens it, highlighting how thoroughly the auction was expected to mark every life. For viewers, this moment offers a different way of engaging with history. Rather than asking only what is known, it asks what is missing and why. Archives are not neutral containers of truth. They are products of the systems that created them. When a system is built to record ownership and profit, its silences can reveal moments where control slipped, however briefly, or where human experience resisted easy capture. The world of the auction block was one of relentless visibility, where bodies, voices, and values were displayed for all to see. To encounter a name that appears without a sale is to encounter the limits of that visibility. It reminds the viewer that history is shaped not only by what was written down, but also by what went unrecorded, overlooked, or deliberately omitted. In those gaps, meaning can reside as powerfully as in any surviving document, inviting reflection on how lives were lived within systems that sought to define them completely. In the quiet spaces between surviving documents, historians often encounter lives not as stories, but as fragments. In plantation societies shaped by slavery, records were created for management, inheritance, and profit, not for memory or empathy. Names entered these records not because someone wished to preserve a life, but because labor, property, or obligation needed to be tracked. It is within this narrow purpose that one man's existence first becomes visible, not through a dramatic event, but through an ordinary notation that almost escapes notice. His name appears without ceremony, written in ink that has long since faded, surrounded by other names and figures. There is no description attached to it at first, no explanation of who he was or how he came to be there. It sits within a plantation log, a list meant to account for labor rather than lives. For historians, this moment of appearance is both a beginning and a limitation. The name confirms existence, but it offers no voice, no narrative, only a point of reference from which careful reconstruction might begin. Plantation logs were among the most consistent records produced in slaveholding regions. They tracked work assignments, productivity, punishments, and sometimes health, but always from the perspective of control. When this man's name reappears, it is often such contexts. A brief note indicates his assigned task. Another marks his absence for a day or two without explanation. These entries are unsettling precisely because of their ordinariness. They suggest a life unfolding within a system so normalized that suffering required no comment. As more documents are consulted, additional details emerge, though never in a complete form. A probate inventory compiled after an owner's death lists the man among other enslaved people, assigning him an estimated age and a monetary value. He is described in a single phrase, perhaps noting a skill or physical condition, language designed to assist appraisers rather than to capture individuality. The inventory's purpose is clear: to divide property fairly among heirs. The man's presence there signals not a moment of recognition, but one of calculation. Wills and estate papers provide further glimpses, though they too are shaped by priorities far removed from the lives they reference. In one document, the man is mentioned as part of a bequest, grouped with others to be distributed to a particular heir. The phrasing is impersonal, efficient, and final. Ownership changes hands without any indication of consent or resistance. For historians, such moments underscore the difference between being owned and being sold. A transfer through inheritance leaves fewer traces than a public auction, even though the consequences for the person involved could be just as profound. Correspondence between plantation owners sometimes adds texture but rarely clarity. Letters might mention labor shortages, illness, or the need to relocate workers, occasionally naming individuals only when necessary to explain a problem or decision. When this man's name surfaces in such exchanges, it does so briefly, embedded in practical concerns. There is no reflection on his feelings, no acknowledgement of disruption. The letter moves on, as if the mention required no pause. Through these scattered references, a pattern begins to form. The man is present across years and locations, yet always at the margins of the text. His age can be approximated, his skills inferred, his movements traced loosely from one property to another. Family ties, if they existed, are harder to confirm. Records might suggest proximity to others with shared surnames or similar notations, but certainty remains elusive. The archive allows for educated inference, not definitive claims. What stands out most sharply is what does not appear. Despite evidence of transfer from one owner to another, there is no bill of sale bearing his name. No advertisement announces him among a group to be auctioned. No newspaper notice records his public valuation. In a system where auctions were the standard mechanism of exchange, this absence is striking. It suggests that his movement occurred through private arrangements, inheritance, or informal transactions that left fewer marks on the public record. This distinction matters because it reveals the selectivity of historical documentation. Public auctions generated paperwork because they involved multiple parties, legal oversight, and the visibility of commerce. Private transfers, while equally binding for the enslaved, often occurred quietly, recorded only where absolutely necessary. The archive thus preserves not a complete picture of bondage, but a version shaped by administrative need. Lives moved through these systems whether or not the paperwork followed. For historians, reconstructing such a life requires caution and restraint. Each document must be read not only for what it says, but for why it was created. A plantation log reflects managerial priorities. A probate inventory reflects legal obligation. A letter reflects personal convenience or concern. None were designed to tell a life story. To stitch them together into a narrative risks imposing coherence where none existed in the lived experience. Yet within this restraint lies a form of respect. By acknowledging uncertainty openly, historians resist the temptation to fill gaps with speculation that might distort reality. It is possible to say that this man was transferred without being auctioned, but not to say precisely how he experienced that transfer. It is possible to note his skills, but not to know how he learned them or what they meant to him. It is possible to trace his name across documents, but not to recover his voice. The fragility of these records also reminds viewers how easily a life could disappear from the archive altogether. Fires, neglect, and deliberate destruction have erased countless documents. Even where records survive, they reflect the biases of those who produced them. Enslaved people appear when they intersect with property concerns and vanish when they do not. Silence in the archive does not mean silence in life. It means the absence of a recorder with power. In following this man through fragments, the viewer is invited to reconsider what it means to know someone in history. Knowledge here is partial, contingent, and shaped by injustice. The absence of an auction record does not free him from the system. It reveals another way the system operated, quieter but no less coercive. His life unfolded within structures that recorded him only when useful, leaving historians to work backward from traces that were never meant to endure. This method of reconstruction is slow and often unsatisfying. It resists clear conclusions and definitive statements. But that resistance is itself meaningful. It mirrors the constraints placed on the lives being studied, lives bounded by decisions made elsewhere, recorded by others, and preserved unevenly. To acknowledge what cannot be known is not a failure of history, but an ethical stance. In the end, tracing a man through fragments does not restore what was taken from him. It cannot recover lost relationships, private thoughts, or moments of agency that went unrecorded. What it can do is illuminate the workings of a system that reduced lives to paperwork and show how even within that system, records were incomplete. The honesty of that admission matters. It reminds the viewer that history is not a complete ledger but a collection of surviving pieces, and that the gaps between them deserve attention, humility, and care. In a system so heavily defined by public sale, it is tempting to assume that the auction block was the unavoidable passage through which every enslaved life moved. The surviving records, dense with advertisements and bills of sale, seem to reinforce that impression. And yet, even within the rigid legal and social structures of slavery, the auction system was dominant rather than absolute. Its power lay in its efficiency, not in its universality. There were exceptions, shaped by law, custom, and convenience, and it is within these margins that another layer of complexity emerges. Colonial and early American legal frameworks treated enslaved people as property, but not all property changed hands in the same way. Inheritance law, in particular, created pathways of transfer that bypassed the public market altogether. When an enslaver died, the people he owned were often distributed through wills and probate settlements. These documents named individuals not as sellers or buyers would, but as items to be allotted, grouped, or divided among heirs. No auctioneer's voice marked these transitions, yet the consequences were no less final. Ownership shifted quietly, under the authority of law rather than the spectacle of bidding. In some cases, wills specified that certain enslaved people were to remain together, assigned to a single heir rather than dispersed. In others, individuals were parceled out strategically, balancing monetary value across an estate. A man with particular skills might be paired with land or tools, his labor seen as integral to their usefulness. For the enslaved, such provisions could mean remaining on familiar ground or being sent elsewhere without warning. The absence of an auction did not imply stability. It simply meant the decision unfolded behind closed doors. Private sales formed another category of exception. Within extended families, business partnerships, or trusted social networks, enslaved people could be transferred without public advertisement. These transactions relied on reputation and familiarity rather than competition. A planter might sell a laborer to a neighbor, a relative, or a creditor, recording the exchange only in a deed or personal account book. From the perspective of the archive, these sales often appear incomplete, their details scattered or missing entirely. Yet for those involved, they were binding and irreversible. Such private arrangements were often justified as practical or even considerate. Sellers might claim they wished to avoid the disruption of an auction, or buyers might emphasize continuity of labor. These justifications, when recorded, reveal more about enslavers' self-perception than about the experiences of the enslaved. To be sold privately still meant loss of autonomy, exposure to new authority, and separation from community. The difference lay in visibility, not in coercion. There were also cases where enslaved people were retained rather than sold because of specialized skills. Artisans, drivers, clerks, and others whose labor required training and trust occupied a precarious position within the system. Their abilities made them valuable beyond their bodies alone. A skilled cooper, blacksmith, or carpenter represented years of investment, and selling such a person at auction risked losing that accumulated expertise. Owners sometimes chose to keep them, even in times of financial strain, calculating that long-term utility outweighed immediate profit. This perceived value could grant a measure of stability, but it carried its own emotional burden. To be too valuable to sell meant being indispensable to the operation that controlled one's life. It could entail increased responsibility without corresponding freedom, closer surveillance rather than relief. For drivers or clerks, positions that placed them between enslavers and the enslaved, the role could isolate as much as it empowered. Their retention was not an act of mercy, but a business decision framed by exploitation. Trust-based transfers further complicated the picture. In some instances, enslaved people were moved between properties managed by the same family or network, effectively reassigned rather than sold. These transfers might leave minimal traces, noted only as changes in location or labor assignment. From the outside, it could appear as continuity, but for those moved, it marked another rupture, another reminder that their lives were subject to decisions made elsewhere. Within families, the calculus could be even more fraught. Enslavers sometimes kept families intact, recognizing that separation could provoke resistance or reduce productivity. At other times, families were divided deliberately, used as leverage or punishment, or parceled out to satisfy legal requirements. The presence or absence of an auction did not determine these outcomes. Both public and private mechanisms could either preserve or destroy family bonds, depending on circumstances and priorities. Against this backdrop, the case of a man transferred without an auction record becomes more difficult to categorize. Each exception offers a partial explanation, yet none provides certainty. He may have been inherited, passed quietly from one owner to another through legal paperwork that survives only in fragments. He may have been sold privately, his value agreed upon without the need for public bidding. He may have possessed skills that made him more useful retained within a particular operation than exposed to the market. Or his movement may have followed a pattern no longer fully visible, obscured by lost or incomplete records. What complicates the question further is that these categories were not mutually exclusive. A man could be inherited and later sold privately. He could be retained for skill and then transferred within a network. The system was flexible where it served the interests of enslavers, rigid where it constrained the enslaved. To search for a single explanation risks oversimplifying a reality shaped by overlapping motives and uneven documentation. This uncertainty sharpens the curiosity rather than resolving it. If the auction system defined the norm, then exceptions illuminate the structure by contrast. They show how slavery adapted to circumstances, how law, economy, and social ties intersected to manage human lives in multiple ways. The absence of an auction record does not place this man outside the system. It reveals another pathway through it, quieter but equally controlled. There is a temptation, especially for modern audiences, to read these exceptions as moments of relative kindness, to imagine that avoiding the auction spared individuals from its particular cruelties. But such interpretations risk softening the reality of injustice. The auction was one expression of a broader system that denied autonomy at every turn. To bypass it did not restore choice or dignity. It merely altered the form through which power was exercised. Indeed, the very mechanisms that allowed exceptions often deepened entanglement. Inheritance bound enslaved people to the fortunes of families they did not choose. Private sales embedded them within local networks where escape or appeal was more difficult. Specialized roles increased dependence and surveillance. Trust-based transfers relied on relationships that excluded the enslaved entirely from negotiation. Each pathway carried its own constraints, its own vulnerabilities. For the man whose life is traced through incomplete records, the question remains open. Which of these exceptions fits his case, if any? Or does his absence from auction records point to a combination of factors that defies neat classification? The archive does not answer directly, and responsible history resists forcing an answer where evidence does not support it. What can be said is that his experience unfolded within a system capable of both spectacle and silence. The auction block made slavery visible, legible, and routine. Its exceptions remind us that control did not depend solely on public display. Power also operated through paperwork, inheritance, trust, and calculation, often leaving fewer traces but exerting no less force. By examining these exceptions without treating them as relief or anomaly, the viewer is invited to hold complexity without consolation. Not being auctioned does not mean being spared. It means being managed differently. And in recognizing that distinction, the history of slavery becomes neither simpler nor more humane, but more fully understood in all its varied, relentless forms. In the later years of slavery, as laws multiplied and scrutiny slowly increased, the machinery of the system did not become gentler, but more cautious. Slaveholders, merchants, and officials grew increasingly aware that the records they kept could expose them, not only to moral criticism, but to legal and financial risk. It is within this tightening landscape that the most credible explanation for the man's absence from auction records begins to emerge, not as a revelation, but as a convergence of pressures that quietly shaped his fate. By this period, slavery was sustained not only by violence and custom, but by paperwork. Estates had grown more complex, debts more entangled, and legal disputes more frequent. Enslaved men were sometimes drawn into roles that placed them close to these systems of control. They handled accounts, managed inventories, supervised other laborers, or moved between properties carrying information as well as goods. These roles did not grant authority, but they created proximity. And proximity, in a world built on concealment and hierarchy, could be dangerous for those who owned them. Records suggest that some enslaved men occupied positions tied to estate management or finances, serving as clerks, drivers, or intermediaries between overseers and owners. Their labor required not just physical effort, but familiarity with routines, routes, and figures that others did not see. They knew which debts remained unpaid, which goods were missing, which transactions had been delayed or disguised. This knowledge was never acknowledged as such, but it shaped how they were treated. To sell such a man publicly was to risk exposure, to invite questions about where he had been, what he had seen, and what he might say if pressed. In these circumstances, the auction block became a liability rather than an asset. Public sales generated attention. They produced advertisements, witnesses, and records that could be examined later. For enslavers navigating debt, disputed estates, or questionable practices, discretion mattered. A man whose movements or work connected him to legally sensitive matters could not be paraded without consequence. His value lay not only in his labor, but in his silence. This helps explain why some men appear transferred in records without the usual markers of sale. Rather than being auctioned, they were held, reassigned, or quietly moved within networks of trust. Their legal status remained unchanged, but the method of control adapted to circumstance. They became, in effect, custodial enslaved persons, bound to an estate or situation that could not easily release them without unraveling something larger. In some cases, this custodial status was linked to guardianship or legal limbo. When estates were contested or owners incapacitated, enslaved people could be held in place for years, neither sold nor freed, while courts deliberated. During this time, certain individuals were retained specifically because they knew the property, the routines, or the accounts. Their presence ensured continuity. Their absence would have raised questions. Other cases involved punishment without spectacle. Rather than selling a man accused of resistance, theft, or insubordination, an owner might choose to keep him under closer watch, assigning him to roles that restricted movement while extracting maximum utility. Sale could appear, paradoxically, too lenient, allowing the person to leave with a clean slate elsewhere. Retention ensured control, isolation, and deterrence, all without attracting attention. What unites these possibilities is not benevolence, but calculation. The system did not avoid the auction block for this man because it sought to spare him. It avoided the auction because selling him would have endangered others, revealed vulnerabilities, or disrupted arrangements that benefited those in power. His absence from public sale was a protective measure, but the protection was not his. The human cost of this position was profound. To exist near power without possessing it meant living under constant scrutiny. An enslaved man entrusted with sensitive tasks carried the burden of indispensability, knowing that usefulness could prolong captivity rather than ease it. He could not claim ignorance, yet knowledge offered no leverage. Every skill learned became another reason to be kept, another thread binding him to a system that depended on his labor and his silence. This in-between status also produced isolation. Neither field laborer nor free agent, neither fully visible nor entirely hidden, he occupied a category that the system did not name openly. Others might see him as privileged, resented for proximity to authority, while enslavers saw him as a risk to be managed. The archive reflects this ambiguity. He appears often enough to confirm importance, but never in ways that clarify his position fully. The resolution of the curiosity surrounding his missing auction record, then, is not a dramatic uncovering of secret benevolence or extraordinary exception. It is a sober realization that the system shielded itself first. His life intersected with aspects of slavery that could not withstand public scrutiny, and so his movements were handled quietly. The absence that first seemed mysterious now reads as intentional. This understanding reframes the earlier question. If nearly every enslaved man passed through an auction, why didn't this one? Because the auction was designed to expose value, and in his case, exposure carried risk. He was not unsellable, but inconvenient to sell. The market did not fail him, it bypassed him. Such cases remind viewers that the most revealing truths of oppressive systems are often hidden not in their spectacles, but in their evasions. Slavery left abundant evidence of its cruelty, yet it also left silences where cruelty intersected with vulnerability. Those silences were not accidental. They were engineered to protect wealth, authority, and legitimacy. In acknowledging this, the story resists the temptation to assign meaning where the evidence cannot sustain it. There is no redemption in his absence from the auction block, no quiet mercy waiting to be uncovered. There is only a different configuration of control, shaped by fear of exposure rather than concern for suffering. The system that held him understood its own fragility. It knew which transactions could be displayed and which must be concealed. By keeping certain men out of public view, it preserved its appearance of order while hiding its most inconvenient truths. His life became part of that concealment, a human cost absorbed silently into the structure. In the end, the hidden reason does not resolve discomfort, it deepens it. It reveals a system capable not only of violence in the open, but of careful self-protection in the shadows. And it reminds the viewer that history's gaps are rarely empty. They are often filled with choices made to ensure that power remained unchallenged, even if that meant consigning certain lives to invisibility. Away from the auction block, beyond the public rituals of sale and valuation, life under slavery unfolded in patterns that were at once repetitive and precarious. For those who did not pass visibly through the market, daily existence was no less shaped by coercion, but it was shaped in quieter ways. Work began early and ended late, governed by seasons, weather, and the demands of those in control. Whether in fields, workshops, kitchens, or yards, each day followed routines designed to extract labor efficiently while discouraging disruption. The absence of an auction record did not remove a man from this world, it simply placed him deeper within its interior. Mornings often began before sunrise, signaled by bells, horns, or shouted commands. Tasks were assigned quickly, sometimes with little explanation, because the expectations were already known. Labor was measured not only by output, but by obedience, by the willingness to move when told, to stop when ordered, to endure without complaint. Punishments, when they came, were meant to reinforce this rhythm. They could be public or private, swift or prolonged, but they served the same function, to remind everyone watching where power resided. For a man whose role brought him closer to oversight or specialized work, discipline could be subtler, yet no less constant. Outside of work hours, life did not simply belong to the enslaved. Even moments of rest were constrained by surveillance and threat. Yet within these narrow spaces, social worlds persisted. Enslaved communities formed bonds through shared labor, kinship, and necessity. Relationships were forged and maintained under pressure, often across fragmented families and shifting locations. Conversations took place quietly, sometimes at night, sometimes while working side by side, carrying news, warnings, and memory. These connections were fragile. but they were also sources of endurance. For a man known to his masters, visibility was a double-edged condition. To be recognized for skill or reliability could mean protection from certain forms of violence, but it also meant heightened scrutiny. Mistakes were noticed. Deviations were questioned. Trust was conditional and revocable. Each interaction carried the weight of expectation, and each day required careful calibration of behavior. To appear too capable risked increased demands. To appear resistant invited punishment. Survival lay in navigating this narrow corridor without stepping too far to either side. Invisibility offered no simple refuge. Those less visible could be overlooked for opportunities, but they could also be blamed without recourse, punished without explanation, or sold without warning. The system exploited both states, using visibility to extract value and invisibility to enforce disposability. For someone whose life unfolded largely outside public record, invisibility may have reduced exposure to the market, but it did not reduce exposure to control. It merely altered its form. Within enslaved communities, knowledge of one's position circulated quietly. People understood who was watched closely, who moved between spaces, who carried messages or managed tools. These roles shaped social dynamics, sometimes creating distance, sometimes resentment, sometimes protection. A man whose duties placed him between categories might find himself isolated, not fully belonging anywhere. Others might see him as aligned with authority, even if he held no power. Such perceptions could be dangerous, yet they were often unavoidable. Despite these constraints, forms of quiet resistance persisted. Resistance did not always announce itself through escape or open defiance. It could appear as slowed work, feigned misunderstanding, subtle sabotage, or the preservation of cultural practices that masters neither understood nor fully controlled. It could exist in care extended to others, in the sharing of food or information, in the refusal to internalize the language that reduced people to property. These acts rarely entered the record, but they shaped daily life profoundly. Psychologically, survival required constant negotiation. Enslaved people learned to read moods, to anticipate danger, to mask thoughts. For someone known to masters, this vigilance was intensified. Words were weighed carefully. Silence could be safer than explanation. Knowledge had to be carried without revealing its extent. The cost of this self-monitoring accumulated over time, producing exhaustion that left no visible mark but eroded the sense of self. Family life, where it existed, offered both comfort and vulnerability. Relationships provided meaning, but they also created points of leverage for those in control. Threats of separation were common tools of discipline. Decisions about obedience or resistance were rarely individual. They rippled outward, affecting spouses, children, and kin. For a man retained rather than sold, family ties might remain geographically intact longer than others, yet that continuity rested on unstable ground, dependent on the calculations of owners and courts. Moments of change could arrive abruptly. A new overseer, a shift in ownership, a legal dispute, or a financial crisis could reorder routines overnight. The man whose life seemed settled could find himself reassigned, relocated, or punished for circumstances beyond his control. Stability, when it existed, was provisional. The absence of an auction record did not guarantee permanence. It simply meant that change arrived through different channels. In this light, the mystery of his invisibility takes on a different shape. The question is no longer whether avoiding the auction offered safety, but what kind of safety it was and at what cost. Invisibility might shield a person from the spectacle of sale, but it could also bind him more tightly to a particular place or role, limiting movement and possibility. Visibility might expose one to the market's violence, but it could also create moments of transition, however painful, that altered circumstance. To frame this as a choice would be misleading. Enslaved people did not select between visibility and invisibility. These states were imposed and manipulated by others. Both served the same system. One made suffering public and legible, the other private and obscured. Neither restored agency. Both demanded endurance. Restoring humanity, then, does not mean resolving the mystery neatly. It means recognizing that a life unfolded within these constraints, marked by work, relationships, fear, and resilience, even when records fall silent. It means understanding that ambiguity is not a failure of history, but a reflection of how thoroughly that system erased interior lives while exploiting bodies and skills. For the audience, sitting with this ambiguity can be uncomfortable. There is no clear redemption, no moment where invisibility transforms into freedom. Instead, there is a sustained tension between what can be known and what must remain uncertain. That tension mirrors the lived reality of those who navigated slavery day by day, never knowing which aspects of their lives would be seen, recorded, or used against them. In the end, asking whether invisibility was safer than being seen may be the wrong question. Both were instruments of control, deployed as circumstances required. The more revealing question is how people survived within and between these states, maintaining fragments of identity and connection despite a system designed to deny both. To acknowledge that complexity is not to resolve it, but to honor the humanity that persisted even when history records only traces. The life imagined here, grounded in what is known and bounded by what is not, invites the viewer to resist closure. It asks for attention rather than answers, for reflection rather than certainty. In doing so, it restores a measure of dignity not by filling gaps with invention, but by respecting the weight of what cannot be fully recovered. In the years after emancipation, the machinery that had once documented slavery with such obsessive care began to fall quiet. Courthouses reorganized their priorities, plantations dissolved or transformed, and records that once served profit and control lost their immediate utility. What survived did so unevenly, shaped by chance, neglect, and choice. It is within this uneven landscape that stories like his came close to disappearing entirely, not because they were insignificant, but because the systems that created records had never intended to preserve them as human histories. Many documents were destroyed deliberately. Fires, floods, and wars consumed county archives and private collections alike, taking with them ledgers, correspondence, and legal papers that had bound lives to property. Other records were discarded more casually, deemed obsolete once slavery ended. Plantation books that had once tracked labor and value were thrown away, reused, or left to decay. What remained often reflected what white institutions considered worth saving: deeds, laws, and accounts that spoke to ownership rather than experience. Even where records survived physically, they did not survive equally. The lives most carefully documented were those that intersected with power, wealth, and legal dispute. Enslaved people appeared in these papers only insofar as they affected those interests. Births went unrecorded unless they altered property counts. Deaths were noted primarily as losses of value. Movements mattered when they involved transfer of ownership, not when they reflected personal upheaval. When a life unfolded without dramatic legal consequence, it often passed through history without leaving a trace. This selectivity creates the illusion that what remains is comprehensive. Archives can feel authoritative, their shelves heavy with paper, their inventories precise. But completeness is deceptive. What survives is not a neutral sample of the past, it is a curated residue shaped by inequality. For every enslaved person whose name appears repeatedly, there were many others who surfaced only once, or not at all. His story is rare not because his life was unusual, but because the conditions that produced records rarely aligned to preserve it. After emancipation, new silence is formed. Formerly enslaved people built lives under conditions that offered little opportunity to document their own pasts. Literacy was uneven, resources scarce, and the pressures of survival immediate. Oral histories circulated within families and communities, but they were vulnerable to loss across generations. Meanwhile, official histories prioritized national reconciliation, economic growth, and political narratives that sidelined the everyday realities of slavery. The absence hardened. For descendants searching generations later, this silence carries emotional weight. A name might surface unexpectedly in a faded ledger, only to vanish again in the next document. Gaps open where family connections should be. Questions multiply without answers. The search becomes not only historical but personal, shaped by the knowledge that something was taken and cannot be fully restored. Each fragment feels precious yet insufficient. Historians encounter these gaps differently but no less profoundly. Training teaches caution, the discipline of evidence, the responsibility to distinguish what can be shown from what can only be suggested. Confronting silence becomes part of the work. It requires humility and acceptance that some lives resist reconstruction, not because they lacked meaning, but because meaning was systematically stripped from the record. To acknowledge this is to recognize the limits of the archive itself. This recognition reshapes the earlier curiosity. If one man's absence from auction records drew attention, how many others moved through similar pathways without leaving even that trace? How many were transferred quietly, retained for inconvenient reasons, or lost between categories of documentation? The archive cannot answer numerically. It can only hint, through patterns and omissions, at a scale far larger than the surviving names suggest. The danger lies in treating rarity as exception rather than evidence. When a story like his surfaces, it can seem extraordinary, inviting focus precisely because it is unusual on the page. Yet that very unusualness points to a structural problem. The system recorded what it needed and ignored what it did not. Lives that complicated the narrative of orderly ownership were more likely to be obscured. Silence in this sense was not accidental. It was functional. Post-emancipation memory reinforced this pattern. Public commemorations, textbooks, and monuments often emphasized emancipation as a moment of closure rather than transition. The complexities of bondage, especially those that challenged simple narratives of cruelty or kindness, were left unexplored. Stories that required sitting with ambiguity found little space. Over time, absence hardened into assumption that what was not documented did not exist in meaningful form. Responsible remembrance begins with resisting that assumption. It does not rush to fill gaps with certainty or invention. Instead, it treats silence itself as historical evidence, asking what conditions produced it and whose interests it served. In his case, the near loss of his story reflects not only the fragility of paper, but the priorities of systems that valued discretion over transparency when transparency threatened power. This approach also reshapes how audiences are invited to engage. Rather than offering a complete life neatly reconstructed, it offers a partial one, framed honestly. It acknowledges what can be inferred and what cannot. It recognizes that speculation, even when well-intentioned, can reproduce the very erasures it seeks to undo by speaking over absence instead of listening to it. The emotional weight of this stance is not light. It asks viewers to accept unresolved questions, to hold discomfort without resolution. Yet that discomfort mirrors the historical reality more faithfully than closure would. Lives shaped by slavery were often left unfinished in the record, their endings unclear, their inner worlds unmarked. To honor them responsibly is to refuse to smooth those edges for narrative ease. In this way, his story becomes less about singular mystery and more about collective condition. He stands in for many whose paths were shaped by systems that documented selectively and remembered unevenly. His near disappearance is not an anomaly, but a window into how history itself is structured by power, loss, and choice. Encouraging responsible remembrance means shifting emphasis from recovery alone to accountability. It means asking not only who is missing, but why they are missing, and what that absence reveals about the past and its ongoing interpretation. It invites care in language, restraint in claims, and respect for the lives that cannot be fully known. The story was almost lost because it was never meant to be found as a story. It survived by accident, through fragments that resisted erasure long enough to be noticed. That survival is fragile, contingent, and incomplete. Recognizing this does not diminish its importance. It deepens it. In the end, the question of how many others shared his fate remains unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. But the act of asking it matters. It shifts focus from isolated mystery to structural silence, from singular exception to patterned absence. It reminds the viewer that history is not finished simply because the archive exists. To remember responsibly is not to claim certainty where none exists, but to sit with what survives and what does not, acknowledging both with equal seriousness. In doing so, the story resists disappearance once more, not by becoming whole, but by being handled with the care its fragmentary nature demands. In the end, what remains most striking is not the mystery of what cannot be known, but the clarity of what his absence reveals. History often teaches through accumulation, through documents piled upon documents, reinforcing what appears solid and certain. Yet sometimes meaning emerges in the opposite way, through what is missing, through the gaps that refuse to close. His absence from the auction record is not a void to be filled, but a form of evidence in itself, pointing toward the inner workings of a system that relied as much on concealment as on display. In the modern study of slavery, Historians have learned to read archives not only for presence, but for omission. Absence does not always signal loss or error. It can indicate deliberate choice. Systems built on domination tend to record what strengthens them and obscure what threatens them. The auction block was one of slavery's most visible instruments, a public assertion of ownership and value. But visibility carried risk. Where exposure endangered profit, legality, or reputation, silence became a tool. His missing sale suggests not randomness, but intention shaped by fear and self-protection. This understanding reframes how slavery itself is remembered. The most familiar images, crowds gathered, bids called out, lives exchanged under open sky, represent only one face of the system. Beneath that spectacle lay quieter mechanisms: private transfers, legal limbo, custodial arrangements, and calculated invisibility. These were not exceptions that softened injustice. They were refinements that allowed it to endure under changing conditions. His story draws attention to those refinements, reminding viewers that brutality did not require constant display to be effective. Absence also challenges the comfort of narrative closure. Modern audiences often look to history for explanation, even resolution. There is a desire to know exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it meant. But responsible interpretation resists that impulse when evidence does not support it. In this case, the absence of an auction record does not invite a dramatic revelation. It asks for restraint. It asks that uncertainty be acknowledged rather than smoothed over, and that inference be clearly separated from proof. This restraint is itself a moral choice. To exaggerate, to invent certainty, or to frame the absence as hidden mercy would distort the past in ways that echo the original erasure. Slavery stripped people of control over how they were seen and remembered. To impose a tidy story now risks repeating that harm. By refusing to turn the man into a puzzle to be solved, the narrative restores a measure of dignity. He is recognized not as a curiosity, but as a person whose life intersected with forces that limited what could be recorded. In this sense, his absence teaches something broader about historical truth. Truth is not always loud. It does not always announce itself in complete documents or decisive moments. Sometimes it resides in patterns, in what systems consistently avoid showing. Slavery depended on clear rules, rigid hierarchies, and extensive documentation. Yet it also depended on flexibility, discretion, and selective silence. His life exposes that contradiction. The system wanted to appear orderly and total, but it was also anxious, vulnerable, and careful about what it revealed. Telling careful stories matters because history does not end in the past. The way slavery is narrated shapes how its legacy is understood in the present. Sensationalism can distance audiences, turning suffering into spectacle. False certainty can create comfort, suggesting that the past is fully knowable and therefore safely contained. Transparency, by contrast, builds trust. It invites viewers to see history as complex, unfinished, and ethically demanding. Within that transparency, the man at the center of this story is reaffirmed as human. He is not defined solely by what is missing from the record. He worked, formed relationships, endured punishment, and made choices within severe constraints. He experienced fear and routine, isolation and connection. These realities do not require full documentation to be acknowledged. They require recognition that a life existed beyond the paper trail, shaped by forces that sought to reduce it to utility. The dignity of restraint lies in allowing that recognition to stand without embellishment. It accepts that some aspects of his life cannot be recovered, not because they lacked importance, but because the system that governed them had no interest in preserving them. To say we do not know is not an admission of failure. It is an honest accounting of how power shapes memory. This approach also shifts attention away from individual anomaly towards structural truth. His absence from the auction block might seem exceptional, but the conditions that produced it were not. They reflect a broader pattern in which systems erase their own complications. When exceptions threaten the narrative of normalcy, they are hidden rather than explained. Slavery did not merely exploit bodies, it managed perception. What could be shown was shown. What could not be defended was obscured. The most disturbing truths of slavery, then, were often not public. They were embedded in routines, in legal technicalities, in private decisions made without witnesses. Violence did not always announce itself through chains and crowds. It operated through paperwork, delay, isolation, and silence. His life, traced through what is missing as much as through what survives, makes that violence visible in a different way. For the viewer, this realization carries weight. It asks for a shift in how history is approached, from seeking dramatic moments to noticing quiet structures. It asks for patience with ambiguity and respect for limits. It challenges the idea that understanding requires total knowledge. Sometimes understanding deepens precisely when certainty recedes. In remembering him, the goal is not to complete his story, but to situate it honestly. His absence from the auction record does not redeem the system that enslaved him. It indicts it. It shows how deeply invested that system was in controlling not only lives, but narratives. It reveals that harm can be administered without spectacle, and that invisibility can be as coercive as exposure. Ultimately, what his life teaches is not a lesson about exception, but about scope. Slavery was not a single practice, but a network of practices adapting to circumstance. Auctions were central, but they were not sufficient on their own. The system required silence as much as noise, discretion as much as display. By attending to absence, history widens its lens, capturing forms of violence that might otherwise remain unseen. His story does not resolve neatly, and it does not need to. Its power lies in what it asks of the present: attention, care, and humility. It asks that viewers resist easy conclusions and remain alert to what records omit as well as what they contain. It asks that remembrance be guided not by drama, but by responsibility. In the quiet space left by his missing sail, a broader truth emerges. Not all violence announces itself. Not all suffering leaves clear marks. Some of the deepest injuries are hidden in plain sight, woven into systems that appear orderly and complete. His life, partially visible and partially obscured, stands as a reminder that history's silences are not empty. They are full of meaning, if approached with the patience and honesty they require.